Hello everyone, it's Glenda and welcome back to my channel, Creative Grandma. I hope everyone is having a happy crochet day. Well, I finally got my hat and scarf done using that beautiful Silk Garden Noro yarn. Isn't it pretty? It's just so beautiful the way the colors work up with this yarn. So this is a reversible stitch pattern, so no matter how you whip that scarf around, it's going to look the same on both sides of your scarf, and that's what I like so much about this stitch pattern. I also made a matching hat using the same stitch pattern. So what I decided to do was do this in two different videos. First, I'm going to do the video for the scarf. I'm going to show you how to do this beautiful stitch pattern, and then that way you'll get used to the stitch pattern and you'll have your scarf made. And then you can come back for part two, where we're going to be doing the same stitch pattern for the hat, but we're going to be working in the round, and then I'm going to show you how to turn your work as you work in the round. So both pieces are going to match. Very pretty project, and I can't wait to get started. So let's go over to my desk. I'm going to show you an up-close look at the stitch pattern, and I'll tell you everything you're going to need to make this project. So let's get started. So for our project today, I am using the NORO yarn. This is made in Japan, beautiful colorways. Now I used some of this, so some of the colors might not be showing in the skein. So let me tell you about the yarn. This is color number 87, and it's the Silk Garden yarn. This is 45% silk, 45% mohair, and 10% wool. It comes in a 50-gram, 100-meter skein. It's classified as a number 4 medium weight yarn. So let me give you some measurements on the scarf, and then I'll tell you how much yarn you need for each project. Now this stitch pattern for the scarf and the hat is called the baby bobbles. Very easy one row repeat. We're going to do a base row, and then row 2 you're just going to repeat until you get your scarf to the length you want. Now this is what it looks like on the right side of the work. You can see those little baby bobbles giving it texture, and then when you turn it over, it's going to have the same pattern on the reverse side. So let me take some measurements. For the scarf is going to measure 7.5 inches wide, and it's 75 inches long. So you can shorten it or you can lengthen it. If you decide to make the scarf longer than 75 inches or you want to add fringe, then you're going to have to buy more yarn. Now for the scarf, you're going to need 6 skeins of the NORO Silk Garden, and these are the 50-gram skeins or the 100-meter skeins. So you're going to need 6 skeins of the Silk Garden in color number 87, or whichever color you wish. Now I purchased my yarn on Webb's Yarn website. They have wonderful prices on NORO yarns, and I believe it's probably the easiest place to find it on the internet, and you might be able to find it at a local specialty yarn store in your area if they carry the NORO yarn, so you can check that out. Now for the matching hat, again we're using the same stitch pattern. You're only going to need 2 skeins of the NORO yarn. So total for the hat and the scarf, you're going to need a total of 8 skeins of the NORO yarn if you want to make both pieces. You're also going to need a size 10J or 6mm crochet hook. So grab your yarn, grab your hook, and let's get this scarf started. I already have my yarn attached to my hook, and I just used the double knot. You can use whichever method you prefer to join your yarn. Now with this stitch pattern, it's very important to work your stitches loosely because we're working a slip stitch. If you get it too tight, then you're going to have a hard time getting your stitches in that stitch. So let's go ahead and begin. We're going to chain 27. You're going to yarn over your hook and pull it through the loop on your hook. This creates your first chain. This loop on your hook does not count as a chain. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Continue until you have 27 chains, and I'll be back and we'll start row 1. I have my 27 chains made, and now we're ready to begin row 1. Now row 1 is our base row. We're going to slip stitch into the 3rd chain from hook. You're going to skip 1, 2 chains, insert into that 3rd chain, and you're going to slip stitch and make sure you do it loosely. Yarn over, pull through that stitch, and pull through the loop on your hook. And again, you want to make sure that you can see the stitch and you don't pull it too tight. Now with this pattern, I highly recommend putting a stitch marker into this stitch. Now what I do is I usually just use a piece of yarn instead of a stitch marker, insert under those top 2 loops of that first slip stitch, and just put a stitch marker or a piece of yarn in that stitch. Now we're going to start our repeat. Very simple repeat. We're going to half double crochet into the next chain. So yarn over, insert into the very next chain, yarn over, and pull through that chain. You have 3 loops on your hook, yarn over and pull through all 3 loops on your hook. And again, do not get your stitches too tight, but keep a consistent gauge. You're going to slip stitch into the next chain, insert into the chain, yarn over, pull through that stitch, and pull through the loop on your hook, but make sure you're doing it loosely. You want to make sure you can really see that stitch and get your hook under it. So let's do it a couple times together. You're going to half double crochet into the next chain, then slip stitch into the next chain. And that is the end of the repeat. Let's do it again. Half double crochet into the next chain, slip stitch into the next chain. And that is the end of the repeat. So go ahead and continue. Work a half double crochet into the next chain and a slip stitch into the next chain. Repeat that across to the very end of your chain, and I'll meet you at the end of row 1. I'm over at the end of row 1 and I have 2 chains remaining, so I'm just going to work the last repeat with you. I'm going to half double crochet into the next chain, and then into the very last chain you're going to work your slip stitch. And that is the end of row 1, and this is what your work should look like. So now I'm going to go ahead and put a stitch marker into my very last stitch, because with this pattern, when you come to the end of the next row, the last 2 stitches can really get tight and it's hard to see where you're supposed to put your stitches. So always best to use a stitch marker if you're not used to doing a stitch pattern. Now we're ready to begin row 2. Row 2 will be our repeat row. We're going to start and we're going to chain 2. 1, 2. You're going to turn your work. Now for this row, we're going to skip that beginning chain 2, and we're going to skip that first stitch right where you have your stitch marker. You're going to skip that stitch. And before we do our next stitch, just pull up a little bit on your hook, make that loop a little bit bigger. Now remember, we're skipping the beginning chain 2, we're skipping the first stitch, insert into the very next stitch, and if you have to turn your work, insert under the top 2 loops and slip stitch. Yarn over, pull through that stitch, and pull through the loop on your hook. And you just want to make sure that that's a nice size loop that you can see your stitch. So now I'm just going to pull my hook up, pull my hook out, and now I'm going to move my stitch marker up to the top of that beginning chain 2. It's a little hard to see. So here is your slip stitch. Here is the top of that beginning chain 2. go ahead and move your stitch marker up to the top of that beginning chain 2. Very important so your work does not get crooked. You have to pay attention to where you start and finish the row. We're going to half double crochet into the next stitch, and again, if you're not sure, if you pull your work, you can see how those holes open up for your stitches, or you can turn it and you can see the top of the stitches. So again, we're going to half double crochet into the next stitch, and that is the end of the repeat. So let's do it again. You're going to slip stitch into the next stitch, which is the half double crochet stitch, insert under the top 2 loops, work a slip stitch through that stitch and through the loop on your hook. You're going to half double crochet into the next stitch, which is a smaller stitch, and this is the slip stitch. Yarn over, insert into that next stitch, going under the top 2 loops, work your half double crochet. And that is the end of the repeat. Let's do it again. Slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. I'll show you one more time. Slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. And that is the end of the repeat. So go ahead and continue. Slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. Repeat that across until you get to the very last stitch, and I'll meet you there. I'm over at the end of row 2, and Creative Grandma made a mistake of where she told you to put your stitch marker. This is the first stitch, but I forgot about the turning chain. The turning chain was where you started and skipped those first 2 chains. So I'm going to take my stitch marker out, and I'm just going to work to the end of the row, and then I'll show you the correct place to put your stitch marker for the next row. So sorry about that. So I'm working on my last repeat. I did my slip stitch. I'm going to work a half double crochet into that last stitch that you can actually see. Work your half double crochet. And this is why it's very important to have those stitch markers. Then we have this skip 2 chain from where we started row 1. So we're going to end the row by placing a slip stitch right into the top of this turning chain, which is very hard to see. So insert right next to the stitch you just worked into the top of that turning chain, work a slip stitch. Pull up your hook and make that a little bit wider loop before you pull it through. So we're just going to go up and put our stitch marker right into that very last stitch that we made of row 2. So row 2 is finished. This is what your work should look like. Again, you should have your stitch marker into the top of that beginning chain 2 and then into the very last stitch. So for this pattern, you're just going to repeat row 2 over and over again until you get your scarf to the length you want. So I'm just going to go ahead and work row 2 one more time with you. So let's go ahead and repeat row 2. We're going to chain 2, and you're going to turn your work. You're going to skip the beginning chain 2, and you're going to skip the first stitch that has the stitch marker, and you're going to slip stitch into this next stitch. Insert under the top 2 loops and slip stitch through that stitch and through the loop on your hook. Now I'm just going to pull a loop up a little bit higher, take my hook out, and you want to come over and you want to go into the very top of that turning chain 2. So count up 1, 2, or if you're not sure, this is your slip stitch, go into the chain right on the right side of that slip stitch. And then just put your stitch marker in that stitch, and I just carry my yarn right up the side. So now that will be the last stitch when you come back over. You're going to half double crochet into the next stitch. And now we're going to start our repeat. Slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. And if you're not sure, turn your work. You can see the top of those stitches. Work your half double crochet. So let's do the repeat again. You're going to slip stitch into the next stitch, which is the half double crochet stitch. Insert under the top 2 loops, work a slip stitch. Now you're going to work a half double crochet into this next stitch, which is the slip stitch. Yarn over, insert under the top 2 loops, work your half double crochet. That is the end of the repeat. Let's do it one more time. Slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. And that is the end of the repeat. So go ahead and continue. Work a slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. Repeat that across to the very last stitch where your stitch marker is, and I'll meet you there. I'm over almost to the end of row 3. We're just repeating row 2. And when you look at your work, you're going to have 2 stitches for your last repeat. And then you're going to have your stitch marker into the top of that turning chain to finish the row. So let's go ahead and finish the row together. You're going to slip stitch into the next stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch. And the most important thing are these last 2 stitches, because these stitches can get very tight and you're going to have trouble seeing them. So when you're ending row 2, just remember that you're going to end with a half double crochet into the stitch you can see, and then you still have 1 more stitch to go to end the row, and that is going to be into the top of this turning chain where you have your stitch marker. Insert into the top of that turning chain where you have your stitch marker, and you're going to work a slip stitch, and make sure you work it loosely. So then just pull your loop up, move your stitch marker up to the top of that very last stitch that you worked. And again, I just carry my yarn right up the side of my work. So then my stitch marker is telling me this is the first stitch of the next row. And then when you come over here, this is going to tell you that this is the last stitch of the row. So again, very important that you use those stitch markers for this pattern to keep those even ends. So row 3 is finished. Again, row 3 is the same as row 2. To continue working on your scarf, you're just going to repeat row 2 until you get your scarf to the length you want, or for a total of 254 rows, which will make your scarf 75 inches. So go ahead and continue repeating row 2 until you have a total of 254 rows made, and I'll meet you at the end of row 254. I'm over at the end of row 254. I just worked my slip stitch into that top of that turning chain, and now I'm just going to fasten off my work. I already cut my yarn, and when I fasten off, I chain 2. 1, 2, pull my hook up, pull the yarn out, pinch, and pull down, and it creates a secure knot. And then I use my yarn needle and weave in my ends in and out through the stitches of the same color, and then back through again. So our scarf is finished. Now, if you wish, you can go ahead and put some fringe on the end of your scarf if you wanted to have fringe. It's a beautiful scarf, and the NORO yarn is what makes it so beautiful. The combinations of colors are just wonderful. I hope you enjoyed today's crochet tutorial of the NORO crocheted scarf. So make sure that you stop back for part 2, where I'm going to show you how to make the matching hat to go along with your scarf. So until next time, happy crocheting, everyone.